Senator, if I could throw you one on domestic policy.
Yes.
The Supreme Court is currently reviewing the constitutionality of the individual mandate in the health care bill. That's an idea that's actually got some conservative roots. It goes back quite a ways. What do you think personally of the individual mandate? I won't ask you for a prediction on what you think the court's going to do, but are we at a point with our nation's healthcare situation where we need to require individuals to pay for their own health insurance?
Well, I carefully considered that idea back when we were having the debate over Hillary Clinton's health care ideas back in that administration. And along with John Chafee and others, we were trying to think through an alternative to the Clinton plan at that point. And the individual mandate was a part of the alternative that we were considering, and we had considerable discussion of that. I mention that because this has come up during the campaign. Opposition to me has said, well, Lugar was for the individual mandate and now he's against it and so forth. Well, our thoughts never progressed to legislation, but it was a pretty vital discussion at the time as to what the alternative would be to whatever Clinton had in mind. And I was associated with Republicans who were trying to think through better health care for Americans. Now, in due course, as people thought more not only about the Clinton ideas that were rejected, but also about our ideas, Republican ideas, it became clear to me that there were constitutional problems with regard to the individual mandate. And this is why it did not arise again from Republicans or Democrats until we got into this current debate. And it came about in part because insurance companies and others simply felt that they wanted everybody to pay. They didn't want anybody off the hook for buying insurance. And others felt in fairness, those who don't buy insurance but who become ill become a liability in the system. My own experience as mayor of Indianapolis had been that we were able to deal using the resources of a community hospital and other charitable groups with all the people in Indianapolis who needed health care, that no one was denied admission to the general hospital or to the specific places where we could offer health care. And so as a result, it was not necessary to mandate low-income people to do something that was going to be virtually impossible. If you were thoughtful, you could provide it. But when this debate came along, and we all went to school again about not only the Constitution, but the other manifestations of this, I was convinced after a year of debating this and opposing it at every stage that the individual mandate was not a good idea. And as a matter of fact, began to question its constitutionality. And I took these thoughts to Greg Zeller, our Attorney General, just after the bill was passed on Christmas Eve. And he put 10 attorneys to work, as he's told me. And they came to the conclusion that there was a constitutional issue here, which was very serious. And that he would join with other attorneys general who were also raising this, which he did. They raised in many cases around the country. Some ruled different ways. But the one that finally went to the Supreme Court, I think, came out of Florida, and they felt that it's unconstitutional. And that was the case made by the attorney before the court when Greg and others came over recently. Now, how the court will finally rule on that remains to be seen. But obviously, President Obama last week was worried enough about it to give a speech admonishing the court not to kick this out, in essence, that to behave yourselves over there. And then this has led to a lot of editorials about Marbury versus Madison and the constitutional review process. And everybody who was sitting there on the court tried to see how Justice Kennedy felt, or even comments by Justice Scalia, for example. So I don't know, but I would say that I think there are constitutional issues here. Now, having said that, then there is a responsibility for Republicans and others really to think of the alternative. Since the court was looking at a bill that did not have a severability clause, it was not clear, and that's why they had 3 days of argument, that you could knock out the individual mandate and have the rest of it. So that's still to be determined likewise, whether all of it must go. Most of it has not yet come into being because people in offices, even as we speak now, are still writing rules for what may occur in 2013 and 2014. So that remains still off the charts as to the constitutionality of any of that. But I would not be surprised if the court found that an individual mandate is unconstitutional. Whether that knocks out all the rest, it will lead to more debate in the Congress, clearly, as to how health care needs are to be met. And so my own thought is that I'm looking carefully, as many others are, at the desire of many states to assume responsibility, as opposed to having a universal federal project here. That, really needs some very severe study in terms of feasibility and fairness, given the fact that we have people coming and going from various states and the eligibility situation. But in answer to your question, I think these are things that we need to be studying presently, not knowing how the court will come out and whether we will have a different situation on our hands. In the current Congress situation, the Congress is not prepared to debate this issue, but that's true of most issues at this particular time. It's sort of a gridlock waiting the election, and that will be a decisive factor probably as to which way this thing goes post the Supreme Court.
If I could do one quick follow-up on this. You had mentioned how, from your experiences in Indianapolis, yes, if someone had gotten sick and they needed care, they would go to the hospital.
Yes.
They wouldn't be denied care. If that were the case, or at least in most municipalities or metro areas, what incentive would anyone ever have to pay for their own health insurance?
The certainty that they would have care. If you're a person who does not have any assurance of this is going to be always an enormous anxiety. And likewise, how long you can stay or how much care you can obtain. If you buy insurance, you begin to at least set out the parameters of what you can anticipate in terms of care for yourself or your family. And that's very important to most of us, to have some pretty good idea what the safety net is. It may very well be that some, as always said, that some young people would say, well, I'm unlikely at age 21 to need hospitalization or to need this or that. As a matter of fact, even at 25, I don't think that and that really was a large group in this picture who some felt had the ability to pay, but were taking for granted that their youth and their good health was saving the money for a while, and that in due course they could fit into this. What's happened in the process, however, is that many companies, many employers who had plans have taken advantage of the situation and said, well, we don't think that we need to have any coverage anymore. Let Uncle Sam take care of it. So that if Uncle Sam comes back and says, well, there's going to be penalties to you for doing that, they said, okay, it's a small price given the premiums that were going up and up and up in our companies. So what I'm finding in Indiana with small firms, they'll take me aside, and after they talk about the fact that they're growing and life is better, they also mention the escalation of their health care costs, maybe 50% in a year or 100% in 2 years, and the fact this is just unsustainable. And they haven't dropped it yet, but they're about to. That's one dilemma of the current system. The promise of so-called Obamacare was that eventually everybody gets covered, but there'll be a turning of the curve, or whatever you call it, and it'll cost less and less. But now almost every actuary says it just goes straight up. There's no end to it. So on the other, we get back to our general budget battles. It's totally inconsistent to be flailing around about deficits and trillions of dollars of debt, and at the same time ignoring really a major factor in this, which is health care in America, whether it bobs up in Medicaid or Medicare.
Senator, kind of doubling back, do you feel that the residency issue is what's really fueling, which is what's kind of a rare primary fight for you? And at the same time, does this either annoy or invigorate you being in a primary fight?
Well, it invigorates me. I think that I discovered when I take as a point of departure on this question, a campaign I was doing on behalf of Republicans in South Bend in October of 2010. At that time, Jackie Walorski was the Republican candidate running against Joe Donnelly, and I had come for a fundraiser for her, and then a meeting of the Republican organization, which they were giving awards to 15 luminaries of the past. But I saw press people outside, and they said, "Are you going to be a candidate for re-election?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, have you heard really what, not condemning all Tea Parties, but certain Tea Parties in northern Indiana have said?" And I said, "What have they said?" And they said, "Well, Coach got a free pass. Somehow or other 4 people crept into the primary, and therefore he got 39% of the votes, and a big victory. And we're not going to let Luger have a free pass. This is going to be mano a mano, and we're going to hold this thing down so there is one candidate." Well, at the time they didn't really have a candidate in mind, but nevertheless a candidate came along. And some were enthusiastic about him, some were not, but nobody else came along. So ultimately, certain Tea Party groups had conventions and endorsed my opponent. But it was apparent to me that it was not just simply these Tea Party groups, but from the phone calls we were beginning to make in a phone bank operation that has become monumental, we were finding essentially that very conservative Republicans in Indiana were not going to vote for me. They saw this election as a referendum of sorts. And they really had nobody else in mind, but at the same time, they felt for a variety of reasons, my voting record or whatever may have been the case, that I was not conservative enough. And as a result, they were going to be somewhere else. And that this was a substantial percentage. It was not just simply the occasional person. So I appreciated that we were going to have a rigorous primary election, which we are having. And I would just simply say that it did invigorate me in the sense that having seen all that in South Bend in 2010, we began campaigning immediately. And we've organized in all the counties of Indiana. I mentioned the phone banks because that is a more phenomenal effort, well beyond anything I've ever seen before. But using the micro-targeting methods that businesses use, you discovered who the Republican electorate is in Indiana by age, interest, geography, all the various ways you do it. And then set up programs in which we have over 700 volunteers, even as we speak now, some are on the phone. They've made over 1,400,000 calls. And they are able to do this just punching in the numbers. They get somebody on the line, and they find out what issues people are most interested in. This has not varied during the entirety of the last 9 months. Jobs in the economy is the first. Federal spending, whether now or in the past, or excesses and so forth, is the other. Almost nothing else comes into single digits. Almost no mention of foreign policy or anything outside America. But in any event, I take that seriously. That's what people in the Republican primary want to talk about. And so eventually we get down to the question of my opponent, myself, and how we fare. But we also ask, in the meanwhile, would you like a yard sign? Would you like to be on our email list? Would you like to be a volunteer for the campaign? Various other information of that sort. So we've built up a fairly large number of people now who are receiving our email messages every day. A huge number that are going to deposit yard signs about a week from now in their lawns. And quite a number of people who are volunteering and augmenting the 700 faithful in the phone bank business. And so this leads me to believe that we have been able to stay pretty well on top of what Hoosiers are thinking and try to address that. And likewise, organizationally, are prepared really for a get out the vote campaign that is more rigorous than any I've been involved in.
Senator, when you first ran, did you have any idea of how long you expected to be able to serve? The second part of the question is, at this point, do you know how much longer you want to serve? And finally, what is the unfinished business that you feel is important for you to remain in office for?
Well, I've not made a comment about how long I wish to serve. I'm very grateful to be in good health and spirits. And this is sort of my life, as I told the Rotarians this noon, you know, service above self. This is what I'm involved in. And I'm totally devoted to the issues that we're talking about today, the jobs and the spending and so forth. But I'm also devoted to some things that have come along in the course of time. With my colleague Sam Nunn of Georgia, we brought about the Non-Luger Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. This is a totally counterintuitive historical situation in which Russians that Sam and I had first met when Ronald Reagan sent us to Geneva, Switzerland in 1986, and nothing came of arms control negotiations until the Soviet Union fell. Then these Russians came to our offices in Washington and said, we have an awesome problem. The military is deserting, they're not getting paid, and we don't have any money. Our state is bankrupt. So we need your money. It is US dollars. We need some boots on the ground militarily and in terms of contractors to really, first of all, secure the nuclear weapons that have been aimed at you all this time. You know, we found that there were 13,300 warheads on missiles aimed at every military installation in the United States and every large city in our country that mercifully did not get fired by accident or design. And whether we knew we had an existential problem for 40 years, we certainly did. So Nunn and I were able to get the money appropriated, the last act of Congress of '91, took administration people from the Bush administration to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, so they sort of got religion and understood really what needed to be done. And we have worked at this ever since, working our way through disarming Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and the other situation. We're down to about 5,000 warheads, more or less, in Russia, still on missiles. So, although nobody pays any attention to this anymore, so this is old hat, I don't feel that way. I get a report from the Pentagon each month of how many warheads were taken off that month, how many missiles destroyed. In essence, this is the largest amount of armament of that variety in the world by far, whatever other nuclear program we're talking about. And I believe I'm in a unique position to keep the flame alive, literally, which we have to do frequently. People come into the Congress that have heard of the non-nuclear program, can hardly believe that there are warheads aimed at the United States, and they're totally out of it. They're talking about spending and jobs, but this is sort of one illustration of what I'm about. Now, more recently, Bob Gates asked me a year ago, November, to go to Uganda and Kenya, where people in a humanitarian way set up laboratories or wooden structures. They were pulling together pathogens designed from the blood of animals that had come in that had Marburg disease or anthrax or various other situations that could cause plagues in Africa. And so they were working out solutions for antidotes to this. But they were just putting these pathogens in ice boxes and locking them up. One of the laboratories, there were 300,000 people in a slum there in Kenya, in the capital, poor people right below. And our Defense Department was worried that Al-Shabaab, sort of the equivalent over there of Al-Qaeda, would someday come in and scoop it up, and somebody really got the possibilities of killing off several 100,000 people in Africa, quite apart from carrying it over here, a lot easier than carrying a nuclear warhead. So the idea was that given my contacts with these people, that I could work with them, which we did, so that they didn't feel we were invading their sovereignty. We were able to get security put up around these labs in those countries and now working elsewhere, so that the concentration now is on no longer just nuclear, but biological and chemical. Within Russia, we've set up a factory where they're taking out thousands of shells each day that are filled with nerve gas that Sam and I found in an area called Sucha out in Siberia a long time ago. They're half the way through. But the Russians may be boastful, but they said any one of these shells, if you put it into a football stadium on a Saturday in America, would kill all 50,000 people. It was that magnitude of a problem, and half of it is still there. So I don't want to regale you with all sorts of projects that we still, but it impels me to believe that I can do a lot to help people stay alive in this country, bring about greater peace in the world. And I suppose finally, and this is not, I hope, perceived as an ego trip, but usually as heads of state come, or foreign ministers, or so forth, their ambassadors tell the person, if they don't know it already, you know, try to get into the White House, try to see Secretary Clinton at the State Department, or now Panetta over at Defense, but you ought to go over and see somebody on the Hill. And then our phone rings. And so we see regularly 2 or 3 of these heads of state or foreign ministers every week. And of course they come and go, their governments fall, they go into other sorts of situations, whether it be the UN, other international organizations. But it's a very large group of people with whom I have contact and with whom we are able to work and to make things happen, whether it's in feeding the world, in hunger projects in Africa or the Middle East, quite apart from the weapons of mass destruction business, or in resolving other issues. And I would like to continue that. And so I've not put a time limit on this. I hope that I'll have an opportunity to continue to serve my country in this way.
How have you been preparing for tomorrow night's debate?
How have I been preparing? Reading through a large stack of folders on about every issue that I can think might arise, and that's doing my homework. But we've had, I think, a pretty good collection of not only things that I have written over the years, votes I have taken, likewise things that people wiser than I have written about all these subjects, and tried to continuously digest this in preparation for what we think will be good questions from Hoosiers coming into the debate.
And have you had anybody, have you done practices where someone's portraying Richard Murdoch?
No, no, I don't intend to do that. We will do the very best we can, just simply having done a number of debates in the past or other discussions, controversial issues.
Senator, it's been a pretty intense campaign, obviously. Both of you accusing each other, distorting each other's records, and it's gotten pretty hard fought. As you may recall, Senator Murkowski lost the primary and went another way then, ran a write-in campaign. Is that something that you would, rule out, or if this didn't go your way, or have you given that any thought?
I've not given it any thought because, as I understand the election laws of Indiana, the Alaska example is not really pertinent.
Okay. Indiana law doesn't provide for any such right?
Not that I perceive.
Okay.
Senator, one last question I have for you is, a little less than a year ago, Evan Bayh sat actually in that exact chair where you're sitting right now, and he talked to us about why he was leaving the Senate, and he was very vocal and has remained very vocal about the partisanship between the parties.
Yes.
And there seems to be a public perception that members of Congress, or members, not even members of Congress, but the political parties are far more concerned about preventing a win by the other side than reaching out across the aisle and actually getting anything done. Mm-hmm. You are probably one of the most, well, you are one of the most senior members of the senior body in Congress. What do you feel personally is your role, specifically you, in trying to bridge that and trying to show the American people that the Republicans and Democrats can reach across the aisle and actually get something done?
Well, I think it's a very important quality to be able to bring people together and to get things done. And I think I have had a strong record of doing that throughout the years, of considerable legislative success. But I do so, I would point out, from the standpoint that For example, the United States Chamber of Commerce has once again given me 100% for votes cast, and the Indiana Chamber has endorsed me. Likewise, the National Association of Manufacturers, the NFIB, Federation of Independent Business. I'm perceived, I believe, as a person who came from the ranks of small business, where my brother and I turned around a family business manufacturing food machinery on the west side, and as a manager of my 604-acre farm for over 50 years for a profit each year, as somebody who understands markets, who is very oriented toward private enterprise and toward innovation. So I don't hide that. My feeling is by and large that people understand, in addition, that we're deeply interested in arms control and some of the foreign policy things we've talked about today. And likewise, I've been a champion for attempting to replace foreign oil to bring about greater energy independence as a both strategic foreign policy problem as well as an efficiency problem in America. Our legislative efforts, some of which have come to legislation, some of which are still out there in discussion, call for efficiencies in the use of buildings so that people use less energy, whichever the source may be. And transportation, likewise. And the ability of our nation to be more competitive because we use less of all of the above and are more independent from others so that we are not inhibited in any of our decision making by the lack of those resources. And that quest will continue because people have very different views on what their role is in all of this and what their privileges ought to be. But I would just say that on the energy issue, on arms control issues, even on economic issues, that I've had some pretty good percentage of being persuasive. Some years are better than others. In this particular year, I've admitted to you, I was able to get my bill demanding that President Obama make a decision by parliamentary tactics of an amendment to a Social Security situation. And I've had to work that way this year as opposed to a more straightforward thing of everybody coming together, because people aren't coming together. They're extremely partisan. It's a very bitter sort of struggle every day.
Don't you feel with your seniority and your role in the Senate that you would have a strong voice in trying to break that down?
Yeah, I think so. And in ways that are quieter or not well publicized, for example, in the Foreign Relations Committee, I persuaded the committee not to take stands with regard to Syria, for example, without getting the information.